All right, good afternoon. I am Cinnamon Dornsife, the Acting Director of the SAIS International Development Program. It is my great honor and pleasure to welcome back to SAIS Dr. Francis Fukuyama, who is still affiliated with SAIS as a senior fellow in our Foreign Policy Institute, but he is working full-time at Stanford University as the Olivier Nomellini Senior Fellow. And in this capacity, he has graciously granted our request to return to SAIS for one of his many book launches. He's doing this globally. I was just in Korea and Hong Kong, and I saw the Korean version of Time magazine, and there was Francis Fukuyama on the cover being featured in Korea. So we are lucky to have him here at SAIS. He's going to be talking with us about his newest book. This is the seventh that he has authored solely, known as The Origins of Political Order, from Prehuman Times to the French Revolution. And Frank is going to be signing copies of this book that are being sold by Politics and Prose out in the lobby. He'll be signing them after the book launch at about 1:45 for people that are interested in getting a copy. To Frank's immediate right and my left is Adam Garfinkle, who is the editor of The American Interest, who's going to be providing commentary. And one of the things that I found really interesting about Adam's background is he's also, his newest book is called Jew-centricity, how the Jews get praised, blamed, and used to explain nearly everything. So this is going to be a really interesting commentation. And then we have Michael Woolcock, who is the lead social development specialist at the World Bank's Development Research Group, where he's worked since 1998. His latest book is Contesting Development, Participatory Projects and Local Conflict Dynamics in Indonesia. So we have two very expert commentators to comment on Frank's book. And if I could just add a personal note, I was very honored, Frank, when you asked me to serve as moderator for today's event. I feel a little personal attachment. I was serving as acting director when Frank took his sabbatical to write this book, which in the early days, I understand Michael was responsible for the early title, was Getting to Denmark. And there was a contest that he launched with his students in comparative national systems and his comparative public management classes, et cetera, to come up with a better title. But I understand that the publisher said, you know, it's going to be this one, The Origins of Political Order. So, Francis Fukuyama, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much, Cinnamon. It's really a delight to be back at SAIS. I really cherish this institution. This book was written really almost entirely while I was here, and I drew on many people and comments and help from a lot of people in this room. This event draws together a lot of institutions that are very near and dear to my heart, not just SAIS in general, but the International Development Program that I directed, and the American Interest magazine, of which Adam is the editor. Charles Davidson, where are you, Charles? Is the publisher, which Elliot Cohen and I helped to found back in 2005, and it's actually employed quite a lot of SAIS graduates in its few years of existence. So thank you very much for being here today. I actually previously presented this book in 4 one-hour lectures, and I'm going to try to boil this down now to about 15 to 20 minutes. This really came about in thinking about the problem of development. There's been a lot of recognition on the part of economists in the last few years that you don't get economic growth unless you've got political institutions, unless you've got property rights, a rule of law, a government that can actually provide services. And in the course of thinking about failed states, you know, countries like Somalia, Haiti, Afghanistan, and the like, we face this also as a very practical foreign policy challenge. And this is where Michael Woolcock's title came in, because he wrote a paper with Lamp Pritchett many years ago entitled, the first version of it was Getting to Denmark. They, for some reason, got rid of that title and called it something else. But the name has stuck in my mind because Denmark it's actually not a real country. It's just a mythical place that has democracy, low levels of corruption, good government, and the like. And typically we've gone into places like Somalia or Haiti with this list of Denmark-like attributes that we'd like these countries to have, and we sponsor all of these aid programs, and then we're inevitably disappointed when we don't even get close to Denmark. We don't even actually get close to Kenya in a lot of cases. So the question then arose, especially in work that I've been doing on Melanesia, how did anybody first develop basic political institutions? How did Denmark get to be Denmark? I've had a visiting professorship at Aarhus University in Denmark, and I can tell you most Danes have no idea how their country got to be Denmark. And so the book was an attempt to write a basic treatise on the question of where three sets of institutions come from. So the first is the state, second is the rule of law, and the third is accountable government. The state I define very simply as a centralized hierarchical source of authority that is able to concentrate power and to use it to enforce rules over a defined territory. So the state is all about concentrating power and using it. The rule of law is quite different. It consists of a set of rules that reflect the community's notions of justice. And what's critical for the rule of law to be a true rule of law is it has to be sovereign or superior to the will of whoever happens to be running the government at the particular time, whether it's a president or a prime minister or a king or whatever. The rule is sovereign, and the king operates under the rule. That's what it means to have a rule of law. Accountability I use in place of the word democracy, not because I don't like democracy, but accountability is a broader term. When the first forms of accountable government arose in England in the 17th century, in the Glorious Revolution, the king acknowledged constitutional accountability to Parliament, but at that point Parliament only represented 10 to 15% of the population of England, the wealthiest property holders in the realm, and so you would not call that democracy. The other issue that I think is a little bit more controversial is whether you can have non-procedural accountability. That is to say, typically our form of accountability is elections, periodic multi-party elections. But I believe that it's also possible to have moral accountability, that is to say, to educate rulers and princes to feel a sense of responsibility towards the people that they rule over. And I would say that that's actually inherent in Confucianism and in a lot of the Chinese traditions of rule. And so I do believe that there's a kind of broader sense that you can bring to this word. So the state is all about power and the concentration of power. The rule of law limits that power, and accountability limits it further to make sure that it corresponds to the interests of the citizens of the society. And so, in some sense, the modern state that has all three of these institutions is a bit of a miracle. The President of the United States is the most powerful individual in the world. He can nuke half the population of the world if he chose to, but he doesn't because he's limited by these other institutions that make sure that that great concentration of power is only used in certain ways. So the book is really a historical, and again, this is one reason why these two gentlemen are on the panel. It's a history, and I just believe that the way political science is done in today's world is not historical enough, and we don't really understand the actual contingent, complex origins of these institutions. I'm starting this book with China because I believe that the Chinese were the first to get to a modern state, a specifically modern state. I wanted to avoid the Eurocentrism, or indeed the Anglocentrism, of classic modernization theory. If you had taken a course in the world history 100 years ago in an American high school or college, it would have started with Greece and Rome, and then maybe gone to the Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution, and then 1776. Now, it's not that this isn't an important story, and I tell a lot of that story in this book, but it is misleading in a lot of ways because the typical modernization theorist thought that because England, and this really begins with Karl Marx, the first great modernization theorist. The problem with modernization theory is that they thought that England's path of development was a universal one, and they kept asking, well, when are other countries going to start imitating England? And as we'll see, England's institutional development was really peculiar, as was a lot of the rest of Europe's. And in a sense, because I believe that the Chinese were the first to establish a specifically modern state, that is to say non-patrimonial, based on impersonal recruitment and bureaucracy, it seemed to me to make more sense to say, well, Chinese did this first. They did it well before anyone in Europe thought of this. Why do other countries not, why did they not follow China's path, all right? So that was the basic project. So I'm going to tell you a series of stories that come out of these different baskets of institution. Let's begin with the state. Why did the Chinese set up an impersonal state in 221 BC when the state of Qin defeated all of its rivals and set the first unified Chinese dynasty in motion? And the answer to that is pretty simple. It's all a matter of warfare. There's a famous political scientist, Charles Tilly, that you may be familiar with, who famously said, the state makes war and war makes the state. And so if you look at early modern European history, the creation of state institutions was very much driven by the need to organize for warfare. And the Chinese did nothing but fight each other for about a 700-year period from the Western Zhou dynasty up until the beginning of the Qin dynasty. They fought something like 1,200 wars in the spring and autumn period from about the 8th to the 5th century BC. And then another 1,200 wars in the Warring States period. The number of wars only decreased because so many states had been absorbed or conquered that there just weren't that many states to fight these wars. And eventually 3,000 separate, basically tribal organizations all coalesced themselves down into a single state. Now, in some sense, the way I've defined the state is an impersonal institution. And state building in I think the deepest sense is a big struggle against the family. If you think about human nature and what our natural instincts are, we are not, we have this idea, I think, that comes ultimately from Hobbes, that until you had the state or the Leviathan, people were in this anomic state of nature, clubbing each other over the head. And this is really not true, that there was never a point in history in which human beings were not social animals, did not have basic capacities to cooperate with one another. They just did it in smaller groups. And there's two basic biological principles that are universals that all human beings share. One is what biologists call kin selection. Or inclusive fitness, meaning you are altruistic to people that share your genes in proportion with how many genes you share. It's the basis of nepotism, basically. The other principle is that of reciprocal altruism. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. And again, no human being needs to be taught these forms of sociability. You see it among children on the playground. It just happens, and it is the default form of sociability that people will revert to in the absence of institutions that force them to, for example, hire someone with technical qualifications rather than their cousin or their brother-in-law or somebody, all right? So the state, the rise of the state is really a question of how do you get to this impersonal set of institutions. The Chinese go through the same process that the Europeans were to follow 1,800 years later. You're fighting wars, you're aristocrats riding around on chariots. It turns out that if you mobilize peasants in infantry armies, you can beat the aristocrats on chariots. In order to mobilize peasants, you've got to raise money because you've got to pay for them. It means you've got to do cadastral surveys. You've got to establish a civilian bureaucracy that can collect taxes, move the tax revenues to a place where they can pay the soldiers. And gradually you see every one of these institutions forming under the crucible of this intense warfare between Chinese states. The families, the patrimonial families that had run government in the Zhou dynasty eventually literally get killed off because they're all busy, they're too busy fighting one another, and you start getting the promotion of commoners who are selected for their talents rather than their family connections. It's something the Union side had to learn in the Civil War because Abraham Lincoln early on made a lot of patronage appointments to politicians, and the Union lost a number of important battles because you had incompetent generals commanding their forces. And it's only later in the war that the same pressure of military competition forces impersonal recruitment into the government. Now, the Chinese did this, as I said, in the 3rd century BC. The Han Dynasty institutionalized a strong central government. I believe that's the major contribution, kind of world historical contribution of Chinese civilization. It persists today in the contemporary government of China, which is very high-quality authoritarian government. But the Chinese never developed the other two legs. They never developed rule of law or political accountability. All right. Another story, state-building story, comes from the Middle East. Again, as I said, the problem is to get beyond kinship. In the Abbasid dynasty among the Arabs and in the Ottoman Empire, you had perhaps the weirdest institutional effort to defeat the family that anyone's come up with, which was the system of military slavery. In the Ottoman Empire, every few years you'd have this practice called the devshirme, the levy of boys, in which a bunch of people would fan out like football scouts. They'd look for young men between the ages of 12 and 19 in the Balkans, in the Christian parts of the empire. They'd take them from their families back to the Topkapi or the palace in Edirne. They'd raise them as Muslims, and they train them to be senior administrators and generals. And it was these slave soldiers that became the highest bureaucrats running the Ottoman Empire. Now, why did they do this? They did this for exactly the same reason that the Catholic Church was to impose celibacy on the priesthood. They wanted to create a one-generation aristocracy. So initially, these slave soldiers were not allowed to marry. They weren't allowed to have children. If they did have children, the children were then expelled into the general population. And the whole point was to prevent patrimonialism, because what does someone want to do with high status and power if they have a family? They want to turn over that status and the rewards to their families. Turns out Europeans didn't do so well with this. In old regime France, the regime was so broke and looking for money all the time that they began this practice of the sale of offices, venality, in which they'd auction off the post of finance minister to the highest bidder. And naturally, it was a bunch of financiers that bought it. They made huge private gains off of it. There was an institution invented in the early 1600s called the Paulette, by which the privately owned public office then became heritable property that you could turn over to your children. And so individual wealthy French families would appropriate the state and make this, just like their chateau or any other form of property, a completely privatized form of government. And the Turks got around this by this weird institution of military slavery. The Ottoman Empire began to decline the moment that the Janissaries, this elite corps of palace guards, began to demand positions for their children, and the rules began to break down, and you had this reinsertion patrimonialism. It happened in China as well at the end of the Han Dynasty, when these impersonal rules were eroded because of famine, war, general political breakdown. And who benefits from this? It's all of the wealthy elites that then begin to reappropriate the state to their own purposes. All right, so that's the story of state building in a very condensed form. Rule of law is an interesting phenomenon. So I said that rule of law are rules that limit the discretion of rulers to simply do whatever they want. Where does that come from? I think historically the major source of rule of law, understand in that sense, is religion, because organized religion represents the major source of social moral rules that are regarded as higher than the will of the current monarch. That was true in ancient Israel, it was true in the Christian tradition, it was true in the world of Islam, and it was true in the Hindu world. In all of these places, you had religious hierarchies that interpreted the law and acted as judges, and the political authorities were theoretically subordinate to those religious authorities. The only world civilization that did not have rule of law in this sense was China, because, in my view, China never developed a transcendental religion. They had ancestor worship, but you're not required to worship the ancestors of the emperor because they're not your ancestors, right? And so there never was this sense that there's a higher authority to which Chinese rulers were answerable. And in the Western tradition, I actually give the Catholic Church a lot of credit in this book. Everybody, Max Weber and all these other modernization theorists think that everything started in the Reformation, but the Catholic Church actually played a very important role in this. In the 11th century, you had this titanic struggle between a very strong-willed Pope, Gregory VII, who wanted to, first of all, change the rules within the church. At this point, bishops and priests in the Catholic Church could marry, they could have children, and in fact, what did they want to do? They wanted to turn their benefices over to their children. They would get involved in all the court politics, and the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, had the right to appoint bishops in the church to actually make ecclesiastical law. And Gregory said, no, first of all, the moral authority of the church is damaged by the fact that we have nepotism within the church. And so the whole institution of celibacy of the priesthood was adopted for exactly the same reason that the Janissaries weren't allowed to marry and were captured as slave soldiers, to prevent nepotism and patrimonialism from infecting internal church politics. They demanded of the emperor the right to appoint the bishops of the church. This led to a huge conflict called the investiture controversy. It led to a 2-generation war between the partisans of the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor. The Emperor Henry IV was excommunicated. He was forced to come to Canossa barefoot in the snow and wait for 3 days to get absolution from the Pope. But the point is, at the end of this, the church won its independence from secular authority, the right to appoint its own bishops, and the right to make ecclesiastical law on its own. And in a sense, the foundations of European law and the idea that you have an independent judiciary really starts with the churches turning itself into a modern, hierarchical, impersonal bureaucracy, and impersonal because of the rule of celibacy of the priesthood. There's, a lot of dimensions of the story, because obviously now law is not based on religion, it's based on other principles, but the foundations of an independent legal order. And by the way, all of you from Bologna should be glad to know that the University of Bologna was absolutely critical, because that was the law faculty where the papal party established a very famous law school. The Justinian Code that had been written in the 6th century by the Emperor Justinian was revived and was taught at that law school, and it became the basis for the civil law tradition that persists to this day in continental Europe, and then all of its offshoots like Argentina, Japan, and so forth. All right. Final story comes from a more modern period. Why do we have democracy? So many people following Tocqueville think, well, this was just an inevitable process. Once you get this idea of equality going, it's unstoppable. Well, that may be on one level, but the fact that you actually got democratic institutions appearing in Europe in some places and others suggests that it wasn't necessary or inevitable, and in fact was due to a lot of historical contingency. Particular contingency was the survival of certain feudal institutions into the modern period. Every European feudal society had an institution called in Spain the Cortes, in France the sovereign courts or parlement, in England the parliament, in Poland and Hungary the diet, in Russia the Ziemski Sobor. All of these represented the nobility, gentry, ecclesiastical authorities, the elites in the country. And medieval kings had to go to these assemblies in order to get permission to do things like raise taxes. And early modern European history is all about these Europeans, Louis XIV, Charles V. They want to behave like a Chinese emperor. They want to be able to centralize all of their authority in a bureaucracy, run everything from their capital city, and it is these parliamentary institutions that serve as the major obstacle to their doing this. They are defeated really in every single European country except one, which is England. In England, for various peculiar reasons, the Parliament hangs together in this great constitutional struggle in the 17th century. Not only do they hang together, but they actually recruit an army. They go to war with the king. They fight the king to a standstill. They cut off the head of Charles I. They go into this period of the Protectorate. They unseat another Stuart king, James II, in the Glorious Revolution. They bring William of Orange from Holland and put him on the English throne. And it is the only country in the world in which Parliament is strong enough to impose a constitution on the monarch, which then becomes the foundation of accountable government. The principle is no taxation without representation. And it is a very short distance to go from the Glorious Revolution in 1688 to the founding of the American Republic based on a very similar principle, with the American founders believing, a la John Locke, that legitimate authority only comes from the consent of the governed. But this idea, appealing as it was, would not have been implemented in the real world were it not for, I think, the rather accidental conditions that allowed the English Parliament, unlike the French sovereign courts, to stand up to their king. And that part of the book, discusses why you get absolutism in some countries and not in others. All of the struggles going on in Central Asia or in the post-communist space or in the Middle East today, I think, have a similar kind of structure. In every one of these countries, you have a government that wants to centralize power and control everything. And the question is, how organized are the social groups that are resisting them? One of the things in European history is it created, in Europe, because of the background of feudalism, you had a lot of well-organized groups like independent cities, a blood nobility living in their own castles, running their own militias, very well armed, and the like, that prevented this kind of Chinese-style accumulation of power. And one of the questions for the future is, under modern conditions, what will be the kind of social mobilization that will allow society to stand up to this kind of centralized power and force it into a constitutional compromise, which is really the basis for modern constitutional democracy. Now, just to conclude, I've gone over my projected time, but let me just give you a couple of concluding observations about how this is relevant to the present-day world. Every business school for the last decade has been talking about emerging markets, India versus China, right? So China is a authoritarian but half capitalist country growing like gangbusters. They can do all these big infrastructure projects very efficiently, high-speed rail, airports. They move 1.2 million people out of the floodplain of the Three Gorges Dam. People kick and scream, but they just do it, and the dam is built and the place is flooded. In India, the Tata Motor Company a couple years ago wanted to build a vehicle assembly plant in West Bengal. And what did they face? Peasants' associations, labor unions, lawsuits, opposition politicians that criticized the deal. And they finally said, okay, enough, we're not doing it here. And so you can see, the big contrast. The Chinese can make these big decisions, ruthlessly execute them, and just get them done. India is a law-governed democracy with accountability, and so it has a harder time making these kinds of decisions. Where do these traditions come from? A lot of people say in India's case it was British colonialism or something, proximate in China's case, maybe the experience of the Chinese Communist Party. It's total nonsense. If you look at the 3,000 years of the history of these two societies, it should be no surprise that they ended up this way, because China, since the 3rd century BC, has been a centralized authoritarian country with only a few interdynastic exceptions, and India is almost the exact complement. It's only been a unified country under the Ashoka, under the Mauryan dynasty, and then under the Guptas. And then when the Mughals and the British came in, they were never really able to unify the subcontinent, and they never penetrated very deeply into Indian society. And so it's not that democracy has a real precedent in India. It's that this kind of Chinese absolutism never got anywhere in Indian society because the society was so resistant to that kind of exercise of power. So final observation is how peculiar Europe was. Europe exits out of a kinship-based tribal system. All the Germanic tribes that conquered the Roman Empire were organized just like Wantoks in Papua New Guinea. They're based on descent groups. And in Europe, the reason that extended kinship came to an end was not because you had a strong state declaring that it was going to be sovereign. It was because of the Catholic Church. Again, said the Catholic Church is a big hero in this story. In the 7th and 8th centuries, the Catholic Church establishes different rules for inheritance. It bans divorce, it bans concubinage, it bans marriage between cousins out to the 5th degree. All of these are strategies by which these tribal kinship groups keep property within the tribe. And the Catholic Church, by doing this and by supporting the rights of women to own and inherit property, took the property, in effect, out of the hands of the tribes. When a widow or a spinster in medieval Europe inherited the family's estate, no children to give it to, where does it go? It goes to the Catholic Church. And so the Catholic Church actually goes from having about 20 to about 40% of the territory in France in the course of the 9th century as a result of this change in the rules. And what it means is that Europe already, within 2 or 3 generations of the conversion of these tribes to Christianity, has already ceased being a tribal kinship-based society. It is much more individualistic. English children and their parents were writing what were called maintenance contracts, because if you foolishly turned over your estate to your children before you died, you couldn't guarantee that they would actually support you in your old age, and so you had to sign a legal contract with your parents to force them to give you your retirement benefits, basically. In an Asian society, this would be just completely unheard of, that you would actually do this on the basis of contract as opposed to simple moral obligation, and yet English people were doing this back in the 12th century, all right? So that individualism was not the product of the Industrial Revolution. It was many, many centuries prior to that, and in fact was one of the long-term characteristics that made the Industrial Revolution possible. And the other big difference is that in European development, the sequence between these 3 institutions was first rule of law, then state building, and then democracy. The fact that rule of law came first meant that European state builders faced big constraints. So the final story I'll leave you with is this great story, the evil Empress Wu, who is my favorite character from Chinese history. She lived early in the Tang Dynasty in the 6th century. She is the only woman in Chinese history to ever rule in her own name and to establish a dynasty in her own name. She started out as a concubine of the 2nd Tang emperor. She got rid of the existing empress by having her own daughter present in the emperor's company and then smothered. And then this was blamed on the empress, and so the emperor got rid of that empress and raised Wu Zhao to be his new empress. She succeeded in killing a couple of her own sons in order to get them out of the way so that she could rule in her own name, and actually killed off a great deal of the Tang nobility by the end of her rule. Now, if you contrast that, and she is execrated by later Confucians as a bad emperor, and also a warning of what happens if you let women get involved in politics. But you contrast that to the behavior of these European monarchs. So in the 1520s, Charles V, the great Habsburg emperor, faced an uprising called the Comunero revolt. It led to a war several years. Finally, it was militarily suppressed. The French went through a similar thing, the uprising of the Fronde under Louis XIV in the 17th century, and again, the king won. What did the king do, these 2 kings do at the end of these wars? He actually pardoned the instigators, the aristocratic instigators, because they were all protected by a traditional rule of law. This had been a Chinese aristocratic revolt against a Chinese emperor. The perpetrators would have been executed and their entire lineages would have been killed because you didn't have the same kinds of legal protections in Chinese society. So there are obviously a lot more stories in this book, but I guess one of the big issues is the degree of contingency in the formation of modern institutions, and in a sense, how lucky we are to have those of us that have gotten to Denmark-like societies to have finally arrived there. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Frank. And the good news for those of us that want to read all these additional stories is this is just Volume 1. So Volume 2 is on its way with more stories like that. So I'd like to turn now to Adam Garfinkel, whose American Interest is the co-sponsor. We're very grateful to him for co-sponsoring the event, and we look forward to his approximately 5 minutes of remarks.
That'll be really easy, 5 minutes, because I actually don't know what I'm really doing here. It's no secret. Most of you, all of you probably, have come to hear Frank and ask questions of Frank, and so I can afford to be very, very brief. I read the book when it was in manuscript, and I made some suggestions to Frank here and there about presentation, a couple of substantive things. I just read it again recently. I can't remember which suggestions he took and which he didn't, but it doesn't make any difference because the result is really pretty good. You should read the book, you know, and probably even more important, you should buy the book. Frank has given you a taste of the tone of it. Now that I've read it a second time, I do have some structural and one epistemological query about it, but I'll address that to Frank privately. What I want to do now is simply encourage you to read it because, as you all know, a book is as good as the knowledge and the purpose that a reader brings to it. And there are a great diversity of readers, but any reader can benefit from this book. Let me just tell you my own example here. You know, I don't know a heck of a lot about Chinese history. I don't know a heck of a lot about Indian history. It turns out, to my surprise, that I know a whole lot less about medieval European history than I thought I did after reading this book. What I studied was Muslim history. The Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Fatimids, the Ottomans, and those guys. So I had a kind of a bilateral way of comparing political culture and political economy. When you see what Frank has done by ranging over so many different political cultures, it's really quite a magisterial accomplishment. And I have benefited by having more perspective now than I had before. I would liken what Frank has done, if you like a metaphor, to a mountain climber. Frank couldn't see what he wanted to see from down in the valley, so he decided to climb the mountain. And at the top of this mountain, whichever mountain it was, I won't say it was Sinai, some other mountain, all right? He achieved a panoramic view in the sense that he was able to look on a variety of political cultures. Moreover, he wasn't just interested in comparative breadth, he was interested in historical depth. And his emphasis on the importance of history and the contingency of history really comes through loud and clear throughout the book. So what you really see here is Frank sort of parting the clouds from the summit, trying to peer backwards in history to the skein of causality that gets us from hunter-gatherer bands to tribal society and then into the modern political economy that combines the state, the rule of law, and forms of accountability. You can sort of see him there, you know, parting the clouds, looking down, oh, there's Hungary in the 9th century, how interesting, and then parting the clouds. So that's really what he does. Let me just end by telling you what I think is the most important part, but in some ways maybe the most problematical part of the insights that he, and they're insights, they're nuggets of insight on every page. This is a book not to be read, but actually to be studied, and then to be read again. But the part about it that I find so intriguing and so insightful, and which Frank really didn't, in his talk just now, didn't go into, is the importance of sequencing. All modern polities have these three attributes. They have a modern state, which is to say a non-patrimonial state that is defined by impersonal social trust. They have the rule of law, and they have one form or another of accountability, whether fully democratic or something a little less. What Frank emphasizes, though, is that the character of regimes is a function to some extent of the sequencing of these three developments. And in the book, he, especially when he talks about Europe, but not just Europe, discusses weak absolutism, strong absolutism, and varieties of regime types that transcend Europe. And the explanatory power of this idea of sequencing is what he relies on most often to do this. And some of this stuff is very counterintuitive. For example, as Frank mentioned earlier, vestiges of feudalism are actually very important in producing modern states because you had kings who were interested in modernizing, but you had feudal constraints that actually empowered the nobility in some respects. So you end up the nobility ends up being able to block the absolutist tendencies of some executives, some kings, but at the cost of actually pushing modernity back, because they're not interested in capitalist economies, they're not interested in cities, and they're certainly not interested in expanding political participation. So there are many ironies and counterintuitive observations that come from this concept of sequencing in the book. To me, it reminds me a little bit of Alexander Gerschenkron's idea of path dependency, except in Gerschenkron's formulation, it's mostly economic. It's mostly an economic phenomenon, and it's more monochromatic. What Frank has done is he's taken essentially a Newtonian concept from Gerschenkron and he's Einsteinianized it. All right? He has expanded the epistemology from economics up through all the other social sciences, and he has then multiplied it out comparatively across a variety of different political cultures historically. And to me, that is the most intriguing part of the book. But all parts of the book are intriguing, and so as I say, read it and buy it.
Adam, thank you for an excellent summary and a really great plug for the book. If you weren't already inclined to buy it, I hope that you are now. I'd like now to turn to Michael Woolcock. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity, and I will try to use my time just to give some sense of how I've interpreted Frank's book for the purposes of development policy, since I work at the World Bank, and one of my jobs, among others, is to try and figure out how do we take this kind of scholarship and how do we use it to try and think more constructively and effectively about some of the issues that we're engaged in. I'm going to open by arguing, though, that I think that Frank's book helps us to get around three of the many different schizophrenias that we face in development policy. First one is that everyone and no one believes in modernization. Right? Everyone believes in modernization in the sense that we all believe in gender equality, we all believe in accountability, we all believe that everyone should be treated equally under the rule of law, we all believe that pregnant women should have access to the best health care possible. All those things are what international development agencies spend their time doing. But those are quintessential modern accomplishments. And yet, when we try to talk about the sort of a theory that underpins the modernizing process, we get spooked very quickly about using the whole language of modernization, because we're then we worry very deeply that we might be seen to be unrepentant, unreconstructed modernization theorists of yore who had much more teleological views about how the world was unfolding. And indeed, one of the reasons that modernization theory had such power was that it drew very tellingly on very strong left and right ideological viewpoints. Both left and right in the mid-50s and 60s were very clear in the kind of views of history that they had. The left just sort of thought there was one stage beyond capitalism, but otherwise everybody sort of had this idea that the world was converging on Western norms. And yet when you read Frank's book, you get a very real sense that modernization is a historical phenomenon, but modernization theory doesn't necessarily have to be the way that we understand this. The second thing that we do and don't believe is that history matters. We all certainly believe in the development policy world that institutions are crucial for service delivery, for helping countries recover from conflict, etc. But we don't believe that history matters because we don't really read any historians. We don't. We think that when it comes to engaging with these questions of the past, that we really only need to consult a very narrow band of economic historians who have a very particular way of defining what counts as a question and what counts as an answer when we think about the past. I was literally in a meeting only a couple of weeks ago where, in discussing the very seminal work of Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, who are the three superstars of a lot of this work now, who was discussing holding court in a discussion with Middle Eastern colleagues, or at least colleagues who work on the Middle East rather, and he was saying, well, basically we kind of have these instrumental variables from the 18th century that help us to understand sort of what happened to development over the last 200 years, but between then and now it's kind of a black box. Literally, I'm quoting, right? We think that because we have one particular variable that one particular group of scholars have tossed into a regression stew that helps us to explain something about the origins of institutions, that we've kind of nailed that question, but for the rest of the world, it's, we don't really know. And that's just the language of a Philistine when it comes to thinking about how actual historians have engaged with these questions over centuries. And Frank's book does a wonderful job of trying to bring a more true historicity and a more true scholasticism around what historians do to bear on these kinds of problems. The final thing that we do and don't believe is that ideas matter. We believe that ideas matter because we spend our time arguing with each other, we have seminars and we training programs and all sorts of things designed explicitly to try and change what people think in terms of their heads. But we assign it zero causal power in explaining the way that the world came to be the way that it is. We think that, whether again from the left or right, we ultimately think that a lot of these things can be reduced to material explanations. It's ultimately about interests. It's ultimately about ideas that are, even in a non-Marxian sense, are ultimately derived from underlying incentives and political power underneath it. But Frank's book does a wonderful job, again, of trying to give ideas their due, and saying they're not the way in which we can explain everything, but consistent with this notion of the highly contingent nature of the way in which things have unfolded, giving a distinct and distinctive space to the role that ideas have played in shaping how and why we think about the world in the way that we do, has been really crucial. And we ignore that in large part to our peril. The final thing that I think that Frank does, which is homage to his mentor for this particular volumes of books, Sam Huntington, is to help us engage more constructively with questions of conflict. Conflict for most development organizations is seen as something we obviously try to avoid or we're trying to recover from. But we don't see conflict as something that we, the international development agents, are actively complicit in. Most of the time we see conflict as happening because of some failure on our part. If only we designed the project in a better way. If only we'd held more training sessions. If only the design was better. Right? One of the great findings, one of the seminal findings of Huntington's 68 was that conflicts came when conditions were getting better. And if development professionals saw more that by definition, they were in the change business, and if they were in the change business, they were in the conflict business. And the more that they were succeeding, the more they were bringing about change, the more likely they would be to put countries and groups into conflict with one another. We'd have a much richer sense of what we're actually doing. We should have big orange warning labels, it seems to me, over most of our work around legal and political reform, because we fundamentally don't know what we're doing when we're engaging with these kinds of us. And the scary part is we think we do. And we think we know what we do because we're ignorant of history, because we're ignorant of ideas, and because we're ignorant of our own role and our own constituent role in this whole process of modernization. And so trying to recognize that we are agents of conflict generation when we succeed, when we build those roads, when we build those schools, when we get those kids educated, when we get those telephone towers up, all those good things that we all do in the name of modernization are all very much agents of change, therefore they're agents of conflict. And if you learn nothing else from this book, it's just how crucial conflict has been to shaping the way in which we've put together, the human family has put together or not over the centuries, effective institutions to manage those ongoing processes of change. Let me just sort of conclude just by sort of posing a general question, I guess, to Frank, and one that came from me as I was reading this book. Like Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs and Steel, Frank makes a great deal out of Melanesia, and having just spent some time there myself and have a work program, I too am intrigued by Melanesia. It's a demographically less than 1/1000th of the world's population, but a quarter of its world's languages are spoken there. So it's an unbelievable anthropological lens through which to see so many of the kinds of issues that we wrestle with today. And I was in a meeting there a couple of weeks ago, surrounded by 40 village chiefs, and I was having a discussion with the 40 village chiefs, And it was a really interesting discussion. But this particular place was characterized by no roads whatsoever. But they really wanted the roads. All their kids were in schools. They had access to pretty good health care facilities. Many of them were wandering around talking on cell phones at the end of the meeting. They're, as it happens, one of the most pious people on the planet. They're 96% Christian when 100 years ago they were all cannibals and headhunters. So a remarkable sort of series of transformations that have occurred in that society. But one of Frank's points is that modernization in many respects, contrary to what Max Weber thought, can happen in these very separate domains. You can actually have political modernization without economic modernization. And that, when for Weber that was sort of inconceivable. They thought these things were a package deal. My question, I guess, is, as an opening one, is whether the 21st century globalization forces have in fact made modernity now a package deal. Can you in fact have all these good things that we want around healthcare, education, transport, communications, and the rule of law and governance and all the rest of it without something like gender equality? Because one of the characteristics of these 40 village chiefs that I was meeting with was, for all their other modern aspects, every single one of them was a man, without exception. Right? So what is that doing when you're increasing the education of all the kids in that village who have educations far beyond that of their own village chiefs, and village chiefs themselves saying, now we're being in effect dissed by our young people, right? They laugh at me, they scoff at me because I can't read, and they can, right? We are completely undermining one form of authority, one crucial form of authority among a people who still walk around carrying sickles and big knives as part of their daily life, but are undermining that very form of authority in the name of doing these good aspects of modernity called education. So is it a package deal now in the future? And what does that mean then for these processes of contestation that we're putting in motion? Indeed, what does it mean for this very act of doing history in a hurry, as one of my colleagues puts it, trying to compress all of the 50,000 years that we learn about in this book now into a project span of 5 years, or sort of in time horizons where we're trying to do things way faster than has ever been achieved anywhere. When it has been achieved anywhere else, where it has been occurred with conflict and violence that's unimaginable, are we in fact, by putting in process these otherwise desirable, universally agreed upon things, complicit in a lot of the other unhappier things that we're trying to avoid? But otherwise, like everyone else, read the book. It's great. And the more we can take the ideas, the institutions, and the history in particular seriously, I think the better we're being faithful to the human knowledge that we have at our disposal for addressing these kind of questions, and ultimately the more likely, I hope, we are to be effective in our jobs of trying to bring some of the many benefits of modernity to other people. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael, for your good insights and bringing us back to kind of practical issues as well. And I noticed that you asked the first question. So, Frank, would you like to answer that question first, and then we'll move to the audience and take your questions. Just so you have a sense of time, we have another 20 minutes left.
Well, that's a great question, whether it's now become a package deal, even if it wasn't in the past. And I would say the answer is still probably no, but the big test of this in a sense is going to be China, right? Because China is modernizing extremely rapidly. It has one important set of institutions, got a very effective authoritarian state. It even has gender equality, to a much greater extent than other parts of the world, social mobility, all those things. But it doesn't have rule of law, and it doesn't have accountability. And one big question is this an equally viable form of modernity? Is it sustainable? Will it just go on forever? Or will it eventually succumb to these internal contradictions? So, for example, one of my colleagues, my new colleagues at Stanford was saying, some of the Chinese students in her class came to her and said, they were kind of in tears at the first assignment because they said, well, where do we get opinions? You asked us for our opinions, but, how do you get opinions about things? Because still in Chinese education, this idea of contradicting your professor or, asking very tough questions is not encouraged. And I think one of the central questions about the future is we believe that all three of these things are inseparable parts of the same modernity, that you can't have Silicon Valley without, questioning authority and without, the kinds of democratic freedoms, political freedoms that we enjoy. And one of the challenges of China is, well, they're trying to do it without important components of that. And I don't presume to know what the answer is. I mean, I'm still going to bet on us, the checks and balances and so forth. But I think it's still it's an open question.
Okay, thanks. Let's turn to the audience. Yes, sir, you were first. Wait, can you wait for the microphone? And if you'd identify yourself, thanks.
Okay, I'm David Folks. I'm a PhD student here.
And a former teaching assistant.
Right, and student. Anyhow, you make this case that political science needs more history, and you're surely correct about this. But it turns out the history you provide is 2 fat volumes, well, 1 fat volume, another one to come, covering thousands of years of history across this huge expanse of space as well as time. And I'm wondering, it's quite intimidating, some of the stuff you can't have known when you sat down to start working on the book. So I want to know what your method is. Say India, I want to know something about India over this long period of time. Do you order the top 3 things on Amazon? Do you call up a professor and go to dinner? Do you just get on a plane? What does it look like?
The answer is number 2. To start my chapters on India, I had several lunches with Sunil Kilnani, who said that he's attending to his wife and couldn't be here, but I'm very grateful to him because, in fact, it's one of those things. You're lost when you open up a new subject with which you're completely unfamiliar, and that's why I think actually social networks are much more important than, in a sense, formal mechanisms for getting familiar, because it's much easier to go to someone like Sunil and say, Sunil, what are the 3 best books to read on India, than trying to go to Amazon and trying to figure out who's got the most, likes, on their page. And so it's a shortcut, that I think you have to take, and that's, why it's great to be at a great university, because you actually have people that know about all these obscure topics and then can act as guides. That's why, a lot of people very commendably try to educate themselves, about these topics, but a lot of times they just waste a lot of energy because, they don't have Sunil Kilnani or the equivalent, to talk to.
Matthias, I noticed your hand second, so. And then we'll go over here.
Thanks very much. Matthias Mathies, I used to be Frank's research assistant in 2002. It looks like a great book, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I guess my question is, you sort of started out with a critique of modernization theory, but wasn't Frank Fukuyama's End of History a bit of modernization theory? So how do you reconcile this book with your earlier work, and has it made you rethink some of your earlier theses?
Right. Well, this book is an effort, yes, to rethink all of those issues that I raised in that first book. I mean, if you don't make any personal progress in 20 years, you shouldn't be an academic, And I would say that probably the thing that, the biggest difference between the 2 books, or what I regard as what I've learned in those 20 years, one of the central lessons, is just the importance of institutions and the difficulty of getting to them, and then all of the historical contingency and everything else that is in the second book, but is probably not in the first book. So these accidental, I use this term that actually was used by Stephen Jay Gould, this idea of the spandrel. A spandrel is in a European cathedral. When 2 arches meet, you get this little triangular thing that is not actually planned, but it's just an accidental byproduct of the fact that you're trying to build an arch. And then the spandrels became decorated, and they became a separate, architectural element. And I think what you realize when you read a lot of history is how many institutions are kind of like spandrels. So who would have thought that this obscure controversy between a medieval pope and the Holy Roman Emperor would actually have an effect on the rise of European law and the independence of, the separation of church and state and so forth. But, the fact of the matter is it did, or the survival, as Adam was saying, of these peculiar institutions, and the fact that law preceded the rise of the state and the survival of these institutions, produced modern democracy. Nobody could have planned things that way. And so I guess that's, the sadder but wiser, later understanding of how this stuff works that I've come to.
I'm sorry, Ina, go ahead. You've been holding, and then I'll come back over here, sorry.
Hi, I'm Ina Hoja, and I also used to study here, and I also used to be a teacher, assistant of Professor Fukuyama. Good to see you. I was wondering, now that I work at the World Bank, so now I'm thinking mostly about policy, in a lot of sort of the African countries like Somaliland that you brought up, that maybe don't have as much as history. So we don't really know where to look in the back and say, look, what system do they have, and therefore what is the next sort of step? I mean, would you then sort of argue that sort of the first step would be the centralization of power, and that in fact sort of having that first and then creating sort of accountability and rule of law is an important step, in some ways creating a state to begin with? I mean, I'm also looking at Nigeria these days, and I mean, these, especially in settings where they're multi-ethnic and multi-religious. And coming back to sort of Mr. Woolcock's, our work on sort of accountability and creating decentralization before these countries are even states maybe actually negative? And are we maybe sort of, speaking of sequencing, are we sort of not doing the right thing?
Thank you.
No, that's a really a good question. And I just think that there's not a single answer that you can give to this. For example, in American foreign policy, one of the big problems that we have created is actually trying to build a state before the other institutions are in place. So we go into Nicaragua in where's Arturo? He's gone. Okay. We go into Nicaragua in 1927. We build a modern National Guard that's the only professional modern institution in the country, but there's no rule of law, there's no judicial system, and what happens, it becomes the vehicle for Anastasio Somoza's dictatorship in a later generation. And I think, the point that both Adam and Michael were making in different ways is that if you don't get that sequencing and the understanding of how they interact properly, you are going to make big mistakes. So, I've written at Adam's behest an article that's in the current American Interest on sale outside this room about Egypt and what Egypt should tell us about sequencing. Egypt and Tunisia seem to me perfect examples of this Huntingtonian theory that rising living standards and better education are actually highly destabilizing. That was one of the central messages of political order in changing societies. Revolutions are not made by the poorest of the poor. They're made by well-educated people that have come to this status recently, and they're stymied by a political system that doesn't permit participation. And you've had all of these efforts by USAID and the World Bank and all these well-meaning outsiders in Egypt to provide education for Egyptians, and not one of them actually thought what we're doing is actually we are trying to destabilize this regime and cause it to, explode at some point. They all thought, well, somehow all good things are going to go together, and in the end, everybody's going to be happier. And I just think that we need a far more complex view of how these different dimensions of development fit together, and they have to be tailored to the individual country, because some countries have parts of the institutions already, you can build on them. Others, this is something Brian Levy and I, we've kind of made this argument about a country like Bangladesh. If you're trying to do good governance in Bangladesh, forget it, It's just so mired in patronage and corruption, you're never going to get anywhere if that's the first thing that you would tackle. On the other hand, if it grows, rapidly for the next 10, 15 years, maybe you can have another opportunity to deal with it. But it's very, very context dependent.
Okay, thank you, sir. Next. And then, Jessica, did you?
Hi, I'm Mohammed Qasim, old enough to be a grandfather to most of you kids here. But, I'd like you to explore what thesis I have. I'm writing a book. I'm an economics historian. I work for the World Bank, lost all my history. I do work at 41 countries. And I asked myself, why are they in this position? And my thinking is that basically the colonial empires are now disintegrating. Whether it's Nigeria to Afghanistan to Burma, Sudan, these places are breaking up. basically not a single person therein had a say in drawing those boundaries. Just because 3 Brits and a Rusky drew up here in Afghanistan does not a nation make. And we're seeing this disintegration dramatically right now. And so my point is, it's going to be a wrecking murders going right round. I live with the Hazaras in Afghanistan, and I heard horrible stories about what happened to them by the Pashtun, going back hundreds of years. Now it's payback time. And good intentions of nation building is really Orwellian talk of nation smashing.
The issue of nation building, meaning the creation of a common culture and sense of identity, is not an issue I talk about in this volume. It's going to be much more prominent in volume 2. And I think that it's something that a lot of development specialists neglect because they think, that's not our business, creating a national language and symbols and, what you're going to teach your children in history books. But I think that it is absolutely critical because you can't get to good government if people have a prior loyalty to a tribe or an ethnic group or a Wantok or some other, social unit. Unless you have this sense that you're all part of a common purpose, you're not going to reduce corruption and patrimonialism, clientelism, all this stuff. And so the question, and one of the great sequencing issues then is that in Europe, all the nation building in that sense, the creation of these homogeneous, more or less homogeneous national cultures, was all done before the rise of modern democracy. This is a point that Pierre Manon, among others, has made. And so all these nice countries in Western Europe that have coherent cultures are the unintended beneficiaries of a very violent nation-building process that took place much earlier in their history when everyone was forced to speak court French, across the nation of France and assimilated forcibly into this, centralized system. Yeah, well, the Germans, everybody went through this, but it's not something that's easy to accomplish in a democratic society, and I think that's one of the really big challenges in multi-ethnic societies today is how to do this and to have all these other good things that Michael talks about, all the democracy and respect for rule of law and the like.
Okay, Professor Wedgwood.
Well, first I want to thank you for the flashback to John Fairbanks and Alexander Gerschenkron and my ancient Harvard historical past. And I also want to, congratulate you on the point that of being willing to rethink the end of history. In fact, history is everything, as we now may recognize, not only in retrospect, but in prospect. But a couple of questions, maybe to try to tease out what's your new metathesis, more than these case studies may allow. One is, it seems to me, you're arguing that the adequacy of satisficing. Your example of the nobility, you may not get to direct democracy immediately, but having some countervailing power is good. So one can learn to love tribalism if the tribes balance nicely and can agree on a foreign policy and don't war amongst themselves. So that's one part, I think. The second is that I think you're making the implicit point that we have to be worried about time, not only on the run-up, but the devolution, that none of this is steady state. That just as you may think you've reached some ideal of Weimarian liberal democracy, damn, Hitler comes. So that this idea of having a safety net, that you've read McIlwain, I've read McIlwain. McIlwain's idea that there is law which persists over time, but every once in a while, with great delicacy and diffidence, the king interposes his pure power to prevent the destruction of law. Mm-hmm. So that the idea of a pure steady-state liberalism is probably illusory. But I do congratulate you on discovering history. It's really nice stuff. We don't teach it here enough. And one does it with a certain humbleness, realizing there are people who've given their lives to Chinese history. But still, it's fun to, I think, to cruise at 35,000 feet.
Thank you.
No, on the first point, I think the one piece of practical wisdom I've come to in looking at all these development problems, I'm all in favor of gradualism and second-best solutions, because it seems to me that so many of our big failures in these interventions has been this Denmark problem that we really expect all of these good things to happen simultaneously, and we can somehow get them all simultaneously without thinking about how much time it's going to take, without thinking about the sequencing, without thinking about just the sheer capacities of these countries to maintain these kinds of institutions. So I think it's a very important point.
Yes, sir, in the middle of the right side.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sadek, researcher in development policy, former AMF, and regular at Dr. Fukuyama's round table. Two really very brief questions. One, what is the defense that you have against the criticism levied as far as the delinking of the kinship by the church in one side? And the second is, where do you place the concept of justice in the achievement of rule of law? Is it integrated, or is it a goal to be achieved?
Well, let me deal with that last question. I actually have a kind of relativistic view in kind of substantively defining justice. I mean, I do believe in the end that you need the state, the rule of law, and accountability for a just political order to exist. But when you talk about something like law and the rule of law, you see that it actually exists in many different forms with many different substantive rules. And so under Sharia law, the role of women is really different from under, modern European law and its Christian, predecessors. But what so a lot of people simply focus on those substantive differences in law without realizing that different societies with differing, moral codes actually face the same kinds of structural problems in organizing their society. So one place where this will become actually possibly a real policy issue is in a future Iran. If the Green Revolution there is to succeed, and if someone like Mousavi or a moderate Islamist comes to power, and they don't want to junk the Islamic Republic, but they want to make it genuinely democratic, are we going to insist that we will only work with a country that has substantively Western law, or would we be content with an Islamic Republic that actually operated, had Sharia courts, but applied them moderately in line with Iranian traditions, but genuinely a rule of law, meaning the executive is constrained by what the courts say? And I think that's not a question that any of us has thought through terribly deeply, or else we just assume, well, of course it's going to be Western law or nothing. But one of the compromises that you may actually have to face is, well, you could actually get rule of law, but it won't be a law that we are completely comfortable with.
Okay, question from our Dean, Jessica Einhorn.
Jessica Einhorn, and first of all, thank you, and it is, of course, a huge pleasure for all of us to be in your presence and to hear about this. I thought with the last question, maybe I'd get you to look ahead to the second book, because you can probably write it as fast as most of us can read a volume. But in any event, and there were questions that I know you reflected on, immigration, technology. It seems as if this first book probably wouldn't have had to deal with those questions because you didn't have technology to transport people across oceans, and demography. This is your demography at SAIS. So my question is, when you look ahead, are those going to be important parts of the world changing? And what happens when the span between one generation and another is greater than the links of kinship that have lasted maybe hundreds of years?
Mm-hmm. So one of the important points about the difference between the Volume 1 and Volume 2 is that the conditions that have existed since about the year 1800 for development are totally different from anything that's in this book. Mm-hmm. I have this chart in one of the later chapters. It comes from Angus Madison, in which he shows average rates of per capita GDP in the world. And they're basically flat from hunter-gatherer times. And then in about the year 1200 in Europe, they start going up very, very slightly, and then all of a sudden you get to about 1820, and then they just go like this, right? And so all of a sudden, every year, year on year, you get 2-3% per capita increases in per capita GDP, and that's the difference between a Malthusian and a non-Malthusian world. So up until the year 1800, you'd have technological change, but it would be overwhelmed within a couple of generations by population growth, and everybody is still mired in poverty and so forth. And we've been, for the last 200 years, now living in the steep part of the slope, and the conditions for institutional change are enormously different because you got a capitalist economy. You think of China. So China traditionally hasn't permitted opposition groups, churches or nobility or bourgeoisie, this sort of thing. In traditional China, they could hang on to that in a Malthusian world. But in today's world, they can't do this because they've got corporations, they've got students, they've got people on the internet, they've got all these different forces impinging from the outside. The rate of social change is enormous. And it means that the conditions under which the Chinese will be able to manage this society are hugely different from dynastic China. And I think, more conducive to the eventual development of, some kind of democratic institution. Now, the one question of the book, even Volume 2 is probably not going to opine on, is whether the whole non-Malthusian period is actually just a blip in human history, because, if you actually do have absolute limits on growth, through global warming or resource constraints or something, we may actually go from like this to like this to like this at some point. But that's Volume 3 and beyond.
Okay, all right. Well, very good. Well, that's a relief to know that there will be Volume 3. So I apologize to people that I didn't get to turn to for your questions. I think everybody can appreciate this is the definition of a Renaissance man. So history, biology, law, religion, sociology, political science, which is his avowed discipline. It's been really fantastic. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Michael.